you say no.
Computer blows up.
Yeah. It says unmute myself. Okay. Got it. All right.
All right, we ready?
Yeah, I think so. We're gonna have some opening remarks by Brandon Bourne, and then I'm gonna make a few real quick things, and we're gonna have some brief presentations followed by hopefully a lively conversation. Okay, so take it away, Brandon.
Awesome. So my name is Brandon Bourne. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Urban Design and Planning in the College of Built Environments, and I'm super excited that we're here today. I direct the Center for Northwest Livable Communities, and we are always looking for opportunities to have meaningful conversations, timely conversations about things that are important to our region. So when Jonathan contacted me and said, yeah, should this be something you'd be interested in? I was like, absolutely, let's do it. So I'm not going to say very much except thank you to Jonathan for that, and what an exciting time for us to be having this conversation. And one of the neat things about it is I'm going to tie in both naming the folks, the departments and centers that made this possible as a recognition, but also just as recognition of how neat it is to bring together a whole bunch of different disciplines to have these kinds of conversations. And so the folks that are responsible for bringing us together today include my Department of Urban Design and Planning, the Jackson School of International Studies, the Northwest Center for Livable Communities, Runstad Department of Real Estate, and the Center for Taiwanese Studies at UW. And if you ever get all that group together again in one place at one time, you tell me, because it's really that's a neat group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I think we're scheduled to go. It's a little after 5:30. We're scheduled to go for. I think we have the room for an hour and a half, and I don't know that we'll need it that long, but we'll just kind of see where it goes. And I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan, and he'll introduce the panel, and we'll go from there. So thanks all for being here.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Hello to everyone here and everyone coming through Zoom. Just very briefly, this panel was put together in part because Julie and I were getting peppered with a lot of questions around social housing, and we thought it would just make more sense to have a forum, and rather than in siloed individual ways responding to people, and we're both very busy, we thought, oh, it'd be nice to at least share our sort of study of this issue. And probably there are other people on campus we're just unaware of who looks at this. We don't, at least I don't fashion myself as the expert on social housing by any stretch of the imagination. But in the process of trying to bring in other people to this panel, I was more familiar with Europe, North America, had less knowledge of what was going on in East Asia, Taipei, Hong Kong, Singapore. Spoke to a colleague of mine, James Lin, chair of the director, Center for Taiwanese Study, and he recommended Professor Chen, who's going to join us here this evening. So Professor, I'm getting feedback. Are you guys hearing it too, or is it just me?
Yeah, I'm hearing a little bit.
Yeah. So I don't know if anyone in Zoom, if you haven't muted yourself, please do. I think it's probably maybe feedback in this space here. Yeah, so Professor Chen, Yi-Ling Chen is, I'll get this wrong, probably she can correct me. She's associate professor of public policy, international studies or affairs, and there's one other part of that title I'm missing. Sorry, Li Qi. And she has been studying, probably of all of us tonight, has been studying this issue the most for a long time. Has been a kind of marginal field of studies. And I think she's excited because it's becoming less marginal and people are more interested in asking her questions about how this applies to places like here. She's like, I don't really know. I work in Taipei on this, or Amsterdam. So she's going to share a little bit of her experience and knowledge in those other parts of the world. I'm going to limit her to 15 minutes. Julie and I are trying to limit ourselves to 10 so that we can focus on a conversation tonight and not just have us lecturing you about these things. But I do think, especially for Yi-Ling, it'll be nice to hear a little bit of in-depth from her research. Okay, so Yi-Ling, if you want, you can take it away.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I'm going to jump into my PowerPoint. Yeah. Chapter 2.
Oh, you can see it here, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm coming from the University of Wyoming School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies. And thank you for the invitation, because it's a surprise for me, because I never thought my research on social housing can be useful for the United States. Yeah, so for me, it's super exciting about this invitation, and also about what's going on in Seattle. And actually, my friends my housing friends in Taiwan or also in Amsterdam, they are super excited about what's going on, because this. So I've been doing research about social housing. Actually, it started from 2010, because Taiwan has a very big social housing movement. So after that, when Taiwan started this social housing movement, actually before 2010, nobody know what is social housing, and there's a lot of discussion about what is social housing. And also when Taiwan start this project, they also have a very many questions to ask. And just like the one we see the social housing proposal in Seattle, is similar question about that who should be the major providers of social rental housing. It should be government, private sectors, public corporation, or tenants cooperatives. There are many questions, and also where the money come from, and who has the priority to live in the social housing, and should it be mixed income, or it should be only for the low income people. And in Taiwan, especially in East Asia, the society actually is predominantly homeownership rate has been very high. So there's also another question about how to deal with the social acceptance of social rental housing. So there's a lot. So after that, I begin to do research about this country and cities. Yeah, so the one I make a bold is the one I particularly familiar with. So today I'm especially focused on Amsterdam and Taipei to talk about their social housing progress. Yeah, but you will see that when I travel, I also begin to find that this is a global housing problem, especially during the pandemic. You will find that housing is especially become the target of investment domestically or internationally. And this is a phenomenon increasing people call it housing financialization, because a lot of international capital. And it's quite tricky, because this international capital a lot of times coming from the equity fund, a lot of invest our pension fund, and they go to the investment company. And after the housing become a very stable investment target, so increasingly housing, the speculation gets more crazy, and this is also create a situation that middle income people in many countries they suffer the problems of housing affordability. So this is a kind of global phenomenon. You can see it in many that in Seoul, in Taipei, and 2020 Amsterdam, they start a very big housing movements, because they use the term called that when the city school teachers, they cannot afford living in the city they are working at, and it means that the housing the problem of housing affordability is a very serious problem. And you also see that housing increasingly become the factor to widen social inequality. And so there's also a term called generation rent, especially for the young people. It's harder. And this is not only about social inequality, it's also about generational inequality. But you can look around the definition of social housing around the world. Actually, there are many different definition, but you will see that the welfare country, the Western European country, they are close to the definition I-135 want to define. Yeah, but there's a lot of issue about who the rent and whether it should be mixed or only for the low income people or subsidized. And some country actually that is not is only for a short period of time, not for now once you get it, you can live there forever. This is very different from the Western countries experience. That Western country, if you got into the social housing, usually you are able to stay for your whole life. Yeah, but I think the general aspect of the social housing is not for profit. Not for profit. So you kind of go into this European country, you'll see that in general, European country have more social housing, and Netherlands has the highest rate of social housing. And there are many different ways, because the green is the social rental housing, but in other countries, you will also see another country use the cooperate housing. This is also can be widely defined as a social housing. So there are many ways to provide social housing. Yeah, and if you look into the country difference, you will also see that, for example, in Netherlands, there's a predominantly housing association provide social housings. But if you compare that England or Austria, you will see the municipal government actually own and operate the social housing. So it can be done in many different ways, and it's quite different in different countries. Yeah, but you will see the situation in Amsterdam is that especially from 1990s, they have a strong pressure to we call it the influence of neoliberalism, because you will see in Amsterdam is quite marvelous. Before 2000, they have even 60% of the housing in Amsterdam, they are social housing. But this number has been decreasing, and now it has been maintained more than 40%. This is a lot of question about how social housing has been funding. And this is the one you can see in Amsterdam. This is housing association is the major providers of social housing. And the majority of the fund actually coming from the loan, coming from the banks. And there's a lot of guarantee behind those loans. Yeah. And the government actually don't provide subsidies. This is the subsidies only provide during the time if the housing association doing the urban renewal projects. But they the subsidies actually is going to the tenants, and they pay the rent to the housing association. So this is the financial system in Amsterdam, how it works. Yeah, but this is the situation. You see that social housing associations, they are not for-profit organization and receive no direct subsidies, but with access to state-backed loans. So this is how the Amsterdam system has been working. But those pressure to coming from EU, but also coming from the domestic politics in the Netherlands. So there's after 1990s, they actually quite said that you will see there's a lot of sale and privatization of social housing. And also the social housing used to be for everyone. And under this pressure, they also call this is a process of social housing residualization. It begins to limit the social housing for the low-income people. And also they begin to force the higher income tenants who they can live there forever, but they begin to increase the rent in order to kind of force them to move out of social housing. Yeah. And you also see the 2015, there's a housing act begin to diminish the role of housing association. And even like very ridiculously, they begin to charge the landlord levy tax on social housing associations. And this is create really a big situation, because the housing prices continue to rise in Amsterdam, because Amsterdam is a very attractive city nowadays, especially after Brexit. A lot of foreign capitals or foreign companies want to relocate from London to Amsterdam. So there's a shortage of affordable housing. But in this time, there's a decrease of social housing, and also the funding for the social housing association also heavily limited because all this new housing act. You are curious about that, the rent, they set a limit of the rent for people who live in the social housing in Amsterdam. And then nowadays that 80% is for the people income no higher than this number. But they have another 10% is for the people higher than the 39,000 euro. And another additional housing is for the higher income people. But in general, this is create a very big problem, especially for the middle income people. They are not qualified for social housing, and all the housing is become too expensive for them to afford, and rent become too expensive. That's why increasingly they have a movement going on. And even at 2017, they start the first social housing festival for the whole European country. And Taiwan also participate into this social housing. I will show if we have extra time later, but that this is the social housing festival. I think this social housing festival is more like a social movement in Europe. They help all these social housing organizations to reunite and try to learn from each other. And this is also a way they try to empower themselves, begin to have an impact on their on their housing policies in each country. So after the very first social housing festival, actually Amsterdam government increase the supply of social housing every year from 30% and increase to 40%. It means that every new housing construction in Amsterdam, they need to be 40% of the new housing there for social housing. And so you can see constantly in those society, there's a struggle and a movement. People want to increase, and there's a lot of protests going on. Especially the recent one is very effective because they really made a whole country compromise. So they are going to increase the social housing and abolish the very ridiculous landlord levy tax on the social housing corporations. And also increase the income limit that made the middle income people now they also can be qualified for the social housing. So this is the one you will see in Netherlands. And move quickly to Taiwan, you will see we started social housing because the housing prices in Taiwan is ridiculous high. If you look at the housing income ratio, Taiwan will be considered the second most expensive city, only next to Hong Kong. And this is also a homeowner society, have very high homeownership rate. And the reason why the housing prices never fall actually is because all the housing policy has been built, and they try to support housing as a target of investment, and there's no effective policy to stop the speculation. And we do have a public housing before we learn the idea from Singapore, but this public housing is not very successful because in the end it's for sale for public housing, and actually it compensates the middle class people rather than people in at the bottom. So this is very problematic. And so the housing prices continue to rise, and increasingly even the middle class people cannot afford. And they really build the social pressures in 2010, and we started a social housing movement. And so the majority people are the disadvantaged people and also middle class people. They also support this idea because they found even themselves cannot buy housing anymore. So when Taiwan started this social housing, this is kind of from ground zero. So we don't know what it is. And we try to learn what that from other countries. So the first movement the international conference, we invite this country, including the from the United States, the assistant secretary was invited. Yeah, but later we found the Dutch can be more inspiration for Taiwan to mobilize society to accept social housing. You see, this is the picture, 2011, but later we focus on more. It's very hard to learn from Amsterdam because they have the social housing for more than 100 years. So it's very hard to transfer, but in more like a inspiration, because during this beginning of the movement, a lot of people in Taiwan, especially the urban planning scholar, actually they are trained in the US. So those failure experience from the United States made a lot of housing people that against the idea of social housing. But fortunately, the Amsterdam people came and they just show that social housing can be nice. And actually, according to their experience, it used to be for everyone who can live in there. So this really served as a very big inspiration for Taiwan. So then nowadays, I would say it's a miracle, because in 2015, this is the proportion of social rental houses, that really not so tiny amount. And nowadays they are a lot more, and a lot more is under construction. So when we look back, I would say this is within these 12 years, it's really like a miracle. You will see this is the luxury private apartment in Taipei. And when you compare the social housing with this private rental luxury housing, super expensive. And this social housing actually, the quality even is better than those private housing, because they have a lot more public space, quite nice, yeah. And then there's a lot of community facility. They have daycare center. They have a lot of shopping design at the bottom, and they also have the elderly center right next to the social housing. So it's really provide a lot of possibility. And they also have a quota for the young people. They live in the social housing, but they need to do the extra work to do the community building. So this is also create a very good sense of the neighborhood, and they also have the artists in residence to create. So it's really a lot better to see this social housing when they build. It's even better than the private rental housing. But I would say this project is not perfect, because if you look at the who is has a priority for the social housing, and also to see the time people are able to live there, is not really ideal. If you look at the definition of more Western European definition of social housing, because you will see the predominantly actually is for the young households, and they cannot live more than 6 years. And it's also, there's a lot of protest and also struggle coming from the social housing movement, because in the beginning, only 10% of the housing is for the disadvantaged people, and they only can live and not above 12 years. Yeah, but this is the I mean, you just think about the movement in Taiwan is not easy, because this is a concept totally new for the society. So for the social housing strategy, their strategy is they just want to have the social housing first, and they continue to improve all the policy later. So it's quite interesting to see that the constantly protest, and nowadays the disadvantaged people increase from 10% to 40%. And nowadays this movement continue, and a lot of middle class people also found that they are not happy about all this luxury housing market available for them. And so there's another movement coming from the middle income people. They want to ask for this co-housing movement. I think look at the definition of co-housing. It sounds more similar to the social housing proposal in Seattle. And this is also the movement. You also see that in Amsterdam, they also increasing the middle income people they think they are able to build the house for their own. So they also begin to influence the policy to increase the core housing. And another aspect of the social housing is that even the increase of social housing, if you don't increase it to a very big amount, it's very hard to really change the housing market very much. So in Taiwan, you will see the increase of social housing, but if the housing prices continue to increase, so you need another extra policy to stop the speculation. So you will see that in Amsterdam, they did make out the policy that once you buy any house and you have to live there, not for the investment or not for it for the rental purpose. If you buy the house and you have to live there, this is another policy in Amsterdam to really discourage the housing speculation. So in general, you will see that it needs a lot of support.
Excuse me, Yi-Ling,
yeah.
just a few more minutes, okay?
Okay, so I would say that you need a lot of support from the government, and but in general, in Taiwan, I still see the movement in Taiwan is a miracle because it's it really provide a beautiful housing, and they change the city and also change the social relations very much. So it's very touching, yeah. So basically, this is my presentation, but I have some this link of the social housing. Maybe you can see it later. I will post the link. You can watch it later. Yeah, I finished my presentation. So thank you for the invitation, and I will stop share.
Thanks, Professor Chen. We'll I'm sure there'll be questions for you after we're finished with the other two talks and presentations. Thank you. So I'm Jonathan Warren. Do I need the sounds good?
We've got closed captions.
Okay, great. I'm a professor in the Jackson School of International Studies. I stumbled onto social housing through a class I taught through the Jackson School. It's called Task Force. We pick a problem to be solved, and then the students just kind of use their experience in global international studies and kind of social sciences, interdisciplinary studies to try to figure out a solution to it. Given the housing crisis, which, if you live, sounds like anywhere in the world, but even in Seattle, it's a pretty obvious challenge and problem. And so that's the one we settled on. After looking around, we found that the example in Vienna was the most compelling to us. And so, as Professor Chen has showed, there's these different ways to approach social housing. There isn't this sort of neat one template. But the one that I'll talk about is very much in line with the Vienna one. And I'll just give you a brief overview of that. What are some of the key components of it, and then how we modified it for the Seattle context. I think the key part of it, and this is probably true of most social housing, is it's disentangled from a kind of market demand and logic. So it's like, what do we do if sort of making projects pencil, let alone making a profit, don't matter? It creates a space to lead with different values, such as aesthetics, community, sustainability, diversity, and then of course, affordability. So that was, one thing that popped out to us, like, how do we do this, or how do other parts of the world think about this? And Vienna really disaggregated that by removing one component of the more conventional way to develop housing, and that was in lieu of a private developer, you had a public developer, and this entity for the municipality would work to identify lands that could be developed, appropriate them through purchasing or whatnot, and then do architectural competitions, and have really high construction standards and interior design expectations. And so these become very coveted projects for architects to work on. And then out of that, you of course still have your for-profit contractors, architects, real estate brokers, financial sector, et cetera. So it's that one slice that's made from the private to the public. And then the municipalities on the hook too, to fill in what some people in this area call capital gaps. So let's say the project costs, I don't know, 12 million, the revenue from it's going to generate 8, there's that $4 million difference, then the municipality is on the hook for that, okay? And in Vienna, they finance this through a 1% payroll tax. And they've been doing it, it sounds like Amsterdam, for a long time, 70 plus years, 60% of the housing there is affordable housing or social housing. So it's a high percentage of it. And it's also, we found it, like Professor Chen said, they focus on kind of integrating income. So it's not just the concentration of the most disadvantaged, but you're also providing housing across the economic scale. So some are market rate, a third roughly market rate, a third middle income, and a third lower income, just to give you a ballpark feel for it. And no one pays more than 30% of their median income. And when you look at Vienna compared to London, Paris, other cities that don't have these models, the cost of rent is much lower, you know. Okay, so we had this we identified what we thought, wow, that's pretty cool. They've been doing it a long time, seems to work well. How could we translate this to the Seattle context? So the students took this idea, and instead of rentals, they were focused on homeownership. So that was one tweak they made. And they developed 2 models. One was a condo complex, what became about 48 units, and one was a 4-plex. And so, you know, total of 52 units to fit the different square foot templates that exist here in Seattle and how much you can build up within the HALA requirements or you know, what's possible within zoning. And so in the end, they did this, and you know, we contacted contractors, what LED gold construction standards are. We did square footage for the units. I could have this a little off, but I think it was about 700 for the 1 bedroom, 700 square feet, 900 plus for the 2, and 1,200 for the 3 bedrooms. So, you know, from what we found, that was more spacious than what's typically being built presently. And on this chunk of land, they would have normally put about 78 units, and instead they put 48. So there's natural light, interior courtyards, public spaces, and all that. The capital gap for that proved to be about $7 million. And some assumptions are, you know, having these 3 different groups. A third would be market rate. So, you know, there's all those things that could vary depending on the project, but just to give you a sense of what assumptions were built into it. And so then we were like, okay, if we were to do this at a scale for, say, you know, 20,000 units a year, it came up to something like $400 million, which was roughly the revenues that are created. And we're careful here, we're not trying to take jumpstart monies, but that's kind of the revenues generated by the jumpstart. So if you took something similar to that, you could, in theory, produce about 20,000 of these units. And for us, affordability was key, but I think I want to underscore equally key is aesthetics, quality construction, generating community. And a lot of the emphasis tends to be on units, and rightfully so. People need housing and they need affordability. But I think if we're going to make upzoning and densification work so that people really want it, if we don't think about quality at all, you're going to get massive backlash pretty quickly. Like, yeah, I'm for it, but I don't want to live in a hovel and I can hear my neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. And I unfortunately, in my experience, and I haven't studied every apartment complex in the city of Seattle, but that tends to be the case. You know, it tends to be pretty shoddy when it comes to those questions of quality. So, you know, this sort of in terms, if you looked at this purely from a rational cost benefit analysis, I think it's clear this is much more cost effective, because all the net benefits you get from people having quality housing that's affordable, that creates a sense of community, that's healthy, where you can have families, all that stuff radically reduces many of the social services that are needed when you don't have that, right? The mental health, the healthcare. Also for businesses, if you're trying to employ people, you're basically having to subsidize the housing for them, you know, if you want them to live reasonably close. And that's really tough for many businesses, especially the smaller to mid-sized businesses, because all the pressure's on you to create a living wage, which in Seattle has to include paying exorbitant rents or mortgages or whatever. So it seemed from that angle, it was a clear, like, wise use of resources. It's not pie in the sky utopian, which some people I've heard kind of cast it as, but it's very economically feasible and doable. It doesn't mean there wouldn't require resources or whatnot, but it's definitely not utopian in at least the models that we built and experiences elsewhere in the world. And so the biggest challenge we found was really that, you know, thinking in terms of a public developer, you're really cutting against the grain of a lot of kind of cultural sensibilities of, you know, these should be done through the marketplace. Why should the government be involved in this way? You know, it really isn't, it's sort of liberating housing construction from the market rather than the conventional ways. Let's liberate the housing market to develop housing, meaning by upzoning, you give away this stuff to developers with the idea you generate more supply, and this will generate quality, affordable housing. But there's really little to no evidence anywhere in the world where that's proven effective if you don't have other ways of shaping the production of housing. Okay. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives you a flavor of what I've looked at and thought about. And I'll pass the baton to Julie, who's worked as a developer for many years, profit, nonprofit, and is also a teaching lecturer, I forget the exact title, in the Department of Real Estate. And are you a graduate student here in urban planning? Yeah. Okay, Julie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. So like he mentioned, for 25 years, I was an affordable housing developer, kind of working on the more traditional programs like tax credit development, and also working around the edges, looking for new models and trying to kind of bump into the workforce housing area, trying to come up with or identify models that don't require all the subsidies since it's so limited, right? And so I've done that for 25 years. I'm teaching here in the real estate department. I teach housing markets and policy, a design studio that works on affordable housing, and an intro to real estate class, and I'm working on my PhD as well, and my research is around housing and mental health, and I look at cooperatives, particularly kind of folks living in cooperatives. So but what I wanted to contribute today is kind of the real estate developer, housing instructor kind of detail. And so I'm gonna share my screen here, and I just put together some simple little models. Let me kind of hide some things on my screen so I can see everything. And I'm doing this kind of in responding to a bunch of questions that I'm hearing, right, about the initiative. And so just kind of laying out in the black and white numbers so that we can all see, you know, what we're talking about, because especially in affordable housing, it's complex and there are terms that not everybody knows what they mean, and it tends to get jumbled. So hopefully I can bring some clarity to kind of the terms and and how affordable housing works in 10 minutes.
Good luck.
So first of all, the social housing in the way that it's different from other affordable housing programs or more traditional affordable housing programs that we have is that it accepts or is targeted to a wide range of incomes. And this particular initiative was looking at up to 120% of median income. So here, is that okay? Oops.
Yeah,
did
a
that
chat. I don't, it came from my
Oh,
thing. A chat.
that's from you.
Yeah, sorry.
So you can see that, okay? So each one of these columns is kind of an income level. So here, up here is 30% of median income. We call that extremely low income. Those are household incomes, so total household incomes for a person of one, which is $27,000 a year. For a household of two, it's $31,000, and a household of three, that's $34,000. Now, these households of 2 and 3, they could be 2 adults, or they could be 1 adult and 1 child, or 1 adult and 2 children, or 2 adults and 1 child, right? So you could have 2 income earners, so you can only have 1 income earner. It doesn't distinguish that in these kind of household sizes that we talk about and we use. So that 30% number, that annual income is what we call extremely low income. Then you step up from that to about 50%, and these are the household incomes that kind of fall under that very low income range. And you work your way up the scale, right? So the very low, things like the Housing Authority, King County Housing Authority, Seattle Housing Authority, they kind of target this income level down here, this 30%, folks that are earning 30%. The tax credit projects, the 9% tax credits, they kind of target this cluster of 30 and 50% right here. So these are these right here are the rents that we're talking about. Step up from that, which is the 4% tax credit program, they kind of span up to the 60% of median income number. But we don't have a lot of those, right? So most of our affordable housing focus, all of our nonprofits and public sector housing authorities target all of our funds, our focus, our work at these income levels. And so what social housing is looking at is also allowing, oh, and let me just say that usually the funds that are used are restricted to these income levels. So you actually can't have folks that make more money in those buildings. So those restrictions come with funds to make that housing happen. And so social housing is looking to work outside of those traditional programs, so they're not restricted to these income levels, and that they can include these higher income levels. And people are like, well, but these people are making a lot of money. Why would we want to include them? And that's a question you're going to have to answer for yourself. I just want to lay out here like what those incomes are. And so the very top level that I think the initiative kind of limits itself at is 120% of median income. So that's 101,000 for a household of 1 person, right? 1 income earner. 116 for a household of 2, could be an adult and a child, or 2 income earners. And then 130 for a household of 3, could be 1 adult, 1 income earner, 2 kids. But this is what those highest income levels could afford to buy out in the market. So we kind of think of those as really good incomes. I mean, but the $101,000 household, a single income earner, they could afford a $325,000 house, which would require a minimum of 17,000 down payment. That'd be a 5% down payment, or a $275,000 condo. And so if you get on Zillow and kind of look, that's, we'll see if there's a lot of that available out there.
Good luck.
And even at the higher income level, like the 130, the household of 3 that's making 120%, they could afford a $450,000 house if they have a $23,000 down payment, or a $375,000 condo. And the reason why the condo
Call me daddy.
The reason why that condo price is lower is because you pay homeowners dues, and so that's calculated into your monthly payment, and so the lender will qualify you based on that higher payment. So I just wanted us to understand kind of
Already?
the folks at
No, you didn't.
You able to mute them?
Yeah. The folks at 120%, this is their option in the market to purchase, right? Other than that's their purchase option, other than that, they're renting, right? So that's kind of their limit. So you check for yourself, but if they can find anything in the market in Seattle for those prices. All right, any questions on that so far? Is that pretty clear? Okay, so I mentioned places like the Housing Authority, they target folks that are 30% of median income. This is the extremely low income range. And so I have kind of 3
No
examples
bragging.
here. I have 3 examples here. So I'm looking at a building that's 150 units. Okay. We've got 3 buildings here. They're all the same size. They cost the same amount to build, $350,000 a unit, 150 units. They cost the same per unit to operate, about $5,500 in expenses a year. And if you've taken my class or you know anything about rental housing, you know that you take the rents that you're generating, right? You calculate them, you subtract what your expenses are, and then you have a leftover amount that is available to service debt on that property. And you don't want to pay cash, right, for the entire thing. And like in this case, this sample building I'm looking at costs $52 million, all right? So we don't want to come up with just $52 million in cash and build a building and have all that cash sitting there. We have the wonders of finance and leverage, right? So if we can put debt on that building and just pay it with the rent every month, then we're better off. We can hold on to some of that cash and do other things with it, right? So when everything is based on the rent you have coming in this case, we're at the lowest rents. Can you see that very well up there? We're at the kind of the lowest rents here, $679 for a studio, $727 for a 1-bedroom, and $873 for a 2-bedroom. I did kind of a mix of units here. That's the number of units of each kind. And so this particular 150 unit building at these rents is available, has about $530,000 a year to pay its debt. And what that translates into is a mortgage of about $8.6 million. But the building costs $52 million to build. So we have, a deficit really of about $43 million. And that's where we have to fill that with subsidy or equity. And when you're a housing authority, you have other federal funds to do that with. But kind of the market cannot take care of or supply housing at this level because you just can't, it doesn't work. The math doesn't work, right? So we need a lot of other funding to be able to make that happen. And that's what those organizations do. And they have to put together a lot of layers of money from different sources to do that, because that's a lot left over, right? That's a lot. And so this next building, 150 unit building, is more close to what a tax credit property would be. It has maybe half of the units at 30%, but it has the other half of the units up at about 50% in median income. And so see, their rents are higher, right? So same unit, 629 or 679 for the 50% folks, it's 1132. And so because we have those higher rents in the building generates more income and we have more left over after our expenses to support some debt. And so just that, chunk of 50% units now, we can get a mortgage of about 15.5 million from that change, right? So, but that still leaves us 36 million left over. That's where tax credit equity comes in. So that's why those programs are so important, right? Because they generate these big chunks of equity that we can put in these projects. However, they are limited, right? We only get a certain amount of allocation of tax credits every year. So we can only fund a few projects, right? It's not, we can't just kind of keep going. So that's the kind of tax credit world type of project, right? With those incomes. So here's what happens if we take all of the income levels that we identified over here, right? The whole range, and we put them all in one building, and we kind of, just for fun, evenly distributed them, the units throughout that whole income range, right? 120, you've got the same number of units at every income level. And so they're all paying their rents, right? Their appropriate rents. And so that generates each year about 2.5 million available to pay debt. And that translates into about a $42 million loan, right? That's $42 million of debt. We said our whole building costs 52 million. So our amount of equity or subsidy needed is about 10 million. So much different kind of distributions of debt and equity. Now in affordable housing, right, or in real estate, you have different levers you can kind of push and pull to that your numbers are kind of sensitive to. One thing might be the expenses per unit. If you have super high efficiency buildings, your expenses might be a little lower because you're not paying all the kind of traditional utility costs. Your expenses could be lower if you're not paying property tax. So the low income or the affordable housing properties, and even our MFT properties, they don't pay full property taxes. So that can reduce expenses and kind of give you some benefit. Interest rate makes a difference, right? If you have low cost, long-term financing, that can get you more debt actually, so that you require less equity. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Is there a break-even distribution that you've done for?
Yeah, so I wanted to compare them all like exactly, right? And not make any changes. But yes, if you change, just a few units here and there, and maybe the term of the debt goes to 40 years, maybe we can get it down to 4%. What's it look like? Now we're down to just a gap of about $1.3 million, just with those tweaks. So you can see kind of how sensitive it can be to those kind of things, especially on that project. Also, as your projects get bigger, to a certain extent, you get some economy of scale, right? And I have here an assumption that our per unit cost to develop the whole thing is about $350,000 a unit. If you can max out and get bigger up to a certain construction type level, you might be able to get that number down. As you go smaller, that number might go up a little bit, right? That's kind of normal economy of scale.
We have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
So Christopher, I saw your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Julie, I really appreciate your table. I think it really helps visualize, breaking down the numbers of what we're looking at. When you talked about the income ranges, you had said that this initiative, I-35, would only be affecting the income ranges above, from 60% above. Is that correct?
No, I had said kind of that whole range. I'm just assuming in what I'm speaking about that it's 30, 50, 60, 70. It's all of that.
It's going to include everything. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and that's what I modeled in this mixed on building. I've got 30%, 50%, 60, 70, 80. I went the whole.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And then we have a question that was written out in the chat. Is it the goal with Seattle social housing, the Seattle social housing bill, to maintain mixed income floors and not differentiate finishes layout? I'm just wondering how much conversation has gone into maintaining social cohesion in the building. We have so few examples of mixed income living.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that. Obviously, it's since I'm
No idea.
Should I answer?
Yeah, if you
Yeah.
know, sure.
Yeah,
Anyone introduce yourself?
I'm and the answer is yes. Social cohesion is definitely a goal of this. We don't want to see what happens with MFTE apartments where specific wings of buildings are for higher income and other wings are for lower income. So yeah, social cohesion is definitely a part of the plan.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's common, like what you were saying, especially with the more for-profit, say you're conforming with them, the HALA requirements, that they will either create separate wings or quality of units. So they'll leave the penthouse for the market rate and then the basement for the affordable. And you really have to be intentional, I think, and build it into your budget, of course, too, to avoid that. But that tends to be there's a lot of pressures to do that when you're trying to make projects at least break even, if not make money. Yeah.
I think that the city of Seattle Office of Housing actually requires, especially for MFTE, the lower income units, the MFTE units, to be distributed throughout the building and distributed throughout unit types. So they kind of already have that in their target to not kind of cluster these units. And you have to remember too, in MFTE, those units are only low income units for 12 years. And then they can go to market. And so the owners of those buildings want to still be able to have units that are market appropriate, right? So, yeah, it's they're trying, right? They're trying, but again, those units are only 12 years affordable.
Are you
and-
almost done, Julie?
Yeah, I'm almost done. I just want to point out one more thing. So, unfortunately, our tax credit program, it's been around for a long time, and it's been like the program, the most prolific program for developing affordable housing. But just a quick overview. So each state gets an allocation of tax credits that they have to decide how they're going to distribute that. And it has to get distributed equitably throughout the whole state, right? So not in Seattle. And so this is an example. This is the 2022 essentially like awards. Who won the allocation? I don't know if you can even see. Can you see that okay? Barely.
No.
No, sorry. So in this first group, so the King County pool is a kind of a set aside amount of tax credit allocation. And here's the winners. These guys are the winners for 2022. You've got 3 Seattle projects, a Kirkland and a Burien, right? And this is the number of units in those projects. So you got 84 from Seattle, 100 in Seattle, and 117, whatever that adds up to, 300 and something. Oh. And you can see here about half of the units are 30% of median income, so that extremely low income. And then the other half of the units are 50% for most of those projects, right? And they also are targeted, all of those projects, all those King County projects are targeted at formerly homeless or transitional housing. So that tax credit money is focused at that.
Hey Julia, you looking nice?
Okay, turn that person. So these down here, this says King County waiting list. These are the 9% applications that didn't get funded for King County. So they'll have to come back the next year and apply with their project. And the rest of these, right, are distributed all over the state. And I didn't print out the whole. You can go online. This is available from the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. So you can see for all of 22, we've got just a little over 300 units that we can produce with this 9% tax credit. And we need how many houses? Yeah. So just, then the second program is the 4% tax credit bond program. It targets the 50% and the 60% of median income, so just slightly higher income. And it usually is a little bit larger buildings.
Wait, hello, I have a question.
And you can see these are
I have a question.
in King County. These are the projects that were funded. We got 3 projects funded. The rest of these are all on the wait list, or they didn't get funded, right? So they have to come back in the next round and apply. So our capacity is limited, right? But these 4%, this 4% award.
Faster with it.
Faster. 186 units in Seattle for that round. All right. That's all
Yeah,
I had.
I think at this point, we'll just open up for general questions and conversation. Please don't forget Professor Chen's here as well, even she's in the Zoom here.
Yeah, let's go, Professor Chen.
Are we able to kick these people out? Yeah.
I'm sorry, please don't kick me. Sorry.
Okay, another question in the chat. Have any nonprofits tried this mixed income model, seeing as how it would make them less reliant on subsidies, and if not, why?
Yeah, so the current programs we have, which are that tax credit program, any additional subsidy that you get usually has these lower income restrictions. So it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge.
I don't really know that much about the campaign. So maybe this is a dumb question, but is there a specific location for the projects in Seattle? How are they determined where they're located?
So the panelists don't know
Okay.
much about the details of the campaign, but Camille, who's here in the audience, knows some more than a lot more. I don't really know any of the details. So you can either answer it quickly now or,
I didn't hear your question.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. How did
Yeah.
you decide that the projects are located?
Projects will be located wherever the public surplus land, where there are buildings that are for sale on the market. So the developer will be able to purchase anything that's on the market or acquire surplus public land to construct upon, or it can also buy land as well. So yeah, anywhere within the city limits of Seattle that is available.
To continue that question, I know I've seen a few plans at the national level that included something like a right of first refusal, which is just where if something goes on the market, the public developer would be first to get in an offer. But is I-135 including any of that, or I don't know what the legal framework is in Washington. I just
Yeah. I don't think I did not include right of first refusal. It was not legal to do so in the city of Seattle. It does require that the city of Seattle conduct a feasibility study if it considers the sale of public land or getting public land on public use. But the feasibility study is not binding.
Yeah.
Are developments built by?
So we had one back.
It's also kind of don't break through like not knowing like residential housing, but I was curious, like, is there any issues like filling proportionally like the higher income housing in like these like mixed income units, or is that just like not an issue that I feel like
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. So in like the mixed income
Uh-huh.
housing,
Yeah.
you're kind of, the model kind of depends on having like a mixed income, like every from like people from every proportion. I was
Right.
curious, like, when you build these, like, are there qualitative studies being done, or is it just like not really an issue to like build these housing units from like getting every proportion of the income ladder, I guess, representation of buildings to create them?
I can answer, but you go first
ahead.
here.
I don't have an answer.
Well, I don't think there's just one way to do it. A lot of it depends how you want to build your budget. It is controversial, though, to do mixed income units. And Julie, correct me if I'm wrong. There's a bit of a bias in many levels, like the real estate industry, the affordable housing industry, and that is, it comes from different perspectives. One is we should really prioritize just using public monies to service the most disadvantaged, because obviously there's people living on the streets, right, and stuff. So that should be the priority. The other one is, are people just on the market going to want to live with poor people? So there's this assumption that they're not going to want that, you know, because it's stigmatized. It has this negative reputation, or has historically in the United States. And so there's a lot of conversation, let's put it that way, around that. And there's also laws, which is why social housing attempts to break away from the exclusive emphasis on lower income groups. I just recently learned that under the Roosevelt administration, FDR, when they were creating some of the public and social housing affordability projects or government policies, they limited it to just the lowest income. So it became illegal to use public monies from the federal, and probably varies by state, for anything above, say, 50% AMI, which is why the affordable housing industry has evolved around targeting those sectors as well. So that's some of my, it may not even be what you're trying to get at, I apologize, but some thoughts in the context of your question.
No, that's all.
Yeah, well, and one thing I think of, so we have MFTE units. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with MFTE units, so it's a program where a private for-profit developer can get some property tax abatement. Oh, MFTE stands for multifamily tax exemption. So I'm a for-profit developer. I build a building, say it's 100 units. In exchange to get some property tax relief, I agreed to provide 20 to 25% of my 100 units targeted at low income, different kind of, and you can actually go on the City of Seattle website for MF-E and see kind of what the incomes are for different unit sizes and stuff. So in those buildings, which we have throughout the city, essentially those are mixed income in a little more lopsided way. You've got 20 or 25% low income, 75% market. So those exist. Unfortunately, those only last for 12 years, those low income units. So they're not permanent, right? But you could call those mixed income buildings.
For other countries that have more widespread use of social housing, is there any like demand side programs like we have in the US, like Section 8 thing?
Maybe Professor Chen knows, we could ask her. I don't know.
That sounds like a good one for professor.
Did you hear that, Professor Chen, the question?
Can you, because the sound is very low, so
Yeah.
I have to. So what, can you repeat the question?
He's kind of far away.
Yeah, so the question is, are there any similar programs in, say, Amsterdam, like the Section 8 programs here in the United States, in which stipends are given for people to rent places
On the demand side.
on the demand side?
To kind of help with social housing as well as their low rents. Maybe they don't have any income.
Yeah, you will see that the people live in the social housing, they are also, they can live in the social housing and they also receive the subsidized. It's not exclude to each other, because they do want to guarantee the social housing association. They have this calculation, because social housing association, they are not belong to the government. They still need the funding to make the whole housing running. So the subsidize giving to the people who live in the social, those people also qualify for social housing. Yeah. I think they also have subsidized for the people who live in the private, who are waiting to get into the social housing, because this is really, now is a high demand for people to get into the social housing. Yeah.
I have a question that's kind of related to the current way that things work, like in Seattle with nonprofit housing and these developments that require, some upfront kind of equity, or but then, as like your charts were showing, they require kind of continuous funding. Is that something that, nonprofits have to continually kind of advocate for additional funding to continue to make these affordable, or is it a one-time thing and then they're kind of left to figure it out after that? I guess, yeah, kind of directed to you, Julie.
Sure, yeah, so the way that so let me see, let me share my screen here before I go back to this. All right, is that okay? Yeah. So because the building debt is sized based on those rents, not any higher rents, but those rents that people are paying. This debt is what stays on the building, and that's kind of the cost of everything, plus the expenses. So these buildings will operate without additional subsidy because they're sized that way at the beginning. You put kind of all the costs into the total development cost, including like the cost of developer fee for the nonprofit so they can survive and pay their staff, the cost of like reserves so they can replace windows and carpets and roofs at some point in the future in the next 30 years. So you put all of those costs, account for all that upfront in this total development cost number, this 52.5, and then you figure out based on those limited rents, what do we have to, what are we able to pay for expenses and debt, and that's it. So the intention is that building operates just off of its rent, and there's not additional subsidy that comes in. And so that's why you need this equity essentially up front, and it can't really be additional debt. So it has to be either tax credit equity or like grants or, 0% loans. And that has to come up front, yeah.
Tax credit equity is limited, right? And that's competitive.
Oh, it's super
It
competitive.
it used to be in the realm of nonprofit developers, but now it's so competitive that for-profit developers are also competing.
Well, it used to be for-profit developers and then, and, yeah, and so, and you can see, right, from the 9%, like there are tons of people applying for it, but only, a handful actually get it. So everybody that didn't get it on this year's round, they have to come back next year. And remember, they've already put a bunch of money into getting these, proposals ready. And so they have to kind of wait.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Chen, since we got you here, one of the things I was curious about is in the Amsterdam model, there's obviously a need to protect the public housing supply once we get it. You were talking about things being sold off to private owners. Did you find any stronger resistance of privately held housing co-ops to the privatization and like more for-profit industry versus obviously the public landlord being more able to do that en masse?
Did you hear that,
Muted.
Professor Chen?
You repeat again, sorry, that, John,
Uh,
Professor, can you help, that repeat the question again?
Yeah, so did you find in Amsterdam that when things were being privatized, co-op housing was more resistant to privatization forces than publicly held housing? Or were they equally impacted by the effect of privatization?
Did you hear that?
I think the privatization forces is that they want to reduce the rule of the social housing corporation. So they want to reduce the number and also force this social housing association to financially sustain themselves. So they have to sell some of them in order to get them. They do have this law, one reduce the loan or the subsidized from the government. They made those social housing association need to financially sustain themselves, and that's why they have to sell the social housing. Do I answer it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. You go ahead, and then I know there's some in the chat too, or
It was
no?
a initiative question.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Thinking more of like the social impact and also the housing demand impact of the social housing, like how would you sell it to people who are, resistant to it because they're like thinking that the market should be solving this issue, like how is it going to impact market prices, and like also how is it going to impact like the neighborhood around where the projects are located, like in your research or in other cities?
Mhm. I'm happy to answer, but I don't want to
Go
hog
ahead,
the
I-
stage, yeah.
We haven't done it yet.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of little questions into the big question, and one is it is true that this is thinking about how you develop housing differently. And we've been in this period of what many people call neoliberalism, in which there's a kind of deification of the market, and the market sort of solves all of our problems, especially if we get out of its way. And we're bumping up against that not being true in so many realms of our society. Childcare, healthcare, housing, you know, and the list unfortunately goes on. I do think there's a kind of inertia and a skepticism still about something like social housing because it does cut against the grain of a market approach or a market exclusive approach. And then there's of course inertia that comes from institutions, the nonprofit housing production side of things, that, you know, people have their careers, they have businesses and all that, in which they might be reluctant for various reasons. And some of them I think can be legitimate and good reasons. I do feel that though that ultimately that by showing what other people have done in other parts of the world, and it's proven effective, and as we're increasingly seeing the housing crisis balloon rather than diminish, there's going to be a bigger and bigger appetite for approaching housing development in a very profoundly different way. And that's what Professor Chen's found in other parts of the world too. It's when it's when the middle income people are also feeling the same pinch. So I just saw in the paper here recently, you know, postal delivery folks can't even get them because they can't live here. It used to be you work for the post office, you could be guaranteed to have like a house, right? That was kind of this cliche of working for the postal service. Not anymore, you know, and I'm sure it goes on. Firefighters, cops, professors, you know, none of us can afford to live in even a reasonably sized studio apartment, let alone a house, right? And so I think as bigger slices of society are confronting these problems, there's an openness to thinking, approaching these differently. And it's going to take time. So I know there's this initiative here that's coming up. The positive of the initiative, it's showing that people are thinking differently, and it's generating these kind of conversations in which people are hungry, like, yeah, how can we just do this in a different way? And I, for one, you know, I talked with civil servants a lot and doing the project with the students, and they were really just like deflated and like, it's impossible. They were just like, we know the current system sucks, but it's better than nothing. So we're just trying to, in the trenches, make the best of a bad situation. And I said that's great. We thank you for that. We laud you for that. But you also have to message that it really isn't working, so that you're not giving this perception that somehow this is the path to go, that if we just do this a little more, it's going to take care of things. And it's going to take this big picture framing. You know, it came up, Brandon and I were talking the other day about healthcare. You know, before Bernie came along, thinking about Medicare for all was just seen as like, wow, that's so radical, you know. I think you just have to start talking with people and saying, hey, here's a way to do it. Here's how it's funded. Not come at it with this heavy-handed ideological way, but like, look, this is what we studied. We get this place is different, but this is a model that's worked and been tested. Let's try it, you know, and if it works, scale it up. And if it doesn't, we'll just try something else, would be my approach to things.
I want to follow that, because in
oh yeah, thanks. Yeah,
it's the same, that in the beginning people really suspicious about social housing, and even people protest whenever there's a project in their neighborhood. And then during that time, actually we got a lot of encouragement from the Korean housing people, because they have the very similar process that people have no imagination, but they just tell us that once you started, you cannot stop. This is that you can see this kind of process happening in Taiwan, that people against it, now they really like it because they see how good it can be. So I think it's important that you just do it, and then people see how good it can be. And I think in America, this is really a serious problem, that there's a people in the middle, they have no choice. Market cannot provide good housing for everyone. So I think this proposal is really a good idea, that people try to find a way to find a solution. Totally supported. Yeah, so, okay.
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a question, about, in your presentation, you talked about, the municipalities filling in the capital gap. And how that could be like, I guess there were some examples where we filled that in with a 1% payroll tax. And I was curious about like, in what you found, of how that was funded, like, what was the reaction like from the city or from like the country where that was happening? Because I just imagine a lot of pushback, because I feel like, it's like, obviously Seattle needs more funding, like we're always trying to tax something like that, but I just like, we need funding for housing, but I've just heard of backlash.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in Vienna, it's 1%, but that didn't happen overnight. And so it's been a time-tested policy that has now, like Professor Chen was saying, I don't know the history of it and if there was initially really politically divided, and then over time there developed this political consensus behind it. But if I were to speculate, I'm guessing something like that happened. And as it proved effective, then they figured out how to fund it at the levels they wanted to develop the scale of housing that was required. I do, and I agree with that. That's how I would approach it here in Seattle. Like, let's test it, start small, but if it really proves effective, figure out how to scale it up, and then it would require these kind of big monies, bigger monies. And ultimately, I just think it has to be led by the government, ideally with federal and state support. But unfortunately, I don't see them changing real quickly. So let's at least try at the municipal level. Vienna does it only at the municipal level, and they pulled it off. All the money in the city, I just can't believe we can't ultimately figure out how to do that. I mean, and it can't be through nonprofits. I'm sorry, there's just no way at the scale and the need that it can just be done through the nonprofit sector. And as I mapped out and others, the market is not going to provide that. It's not going to pencil for developers to create housing, let alone affordable quality housing for everybody. Yeah.
Just kind of following up on that. What we've had is 50 years of neoliberal logic.
Mm-hmm.
No judgment about it. That's just what we got. That logic has relied on a market model. That market model has done two things, I think. As an educator, I think it's when I see public service and what we think about as possible, it's reduced our thinking about what's possible.
Yeah.
We don't have an imagination. So we look at things and we're like, well, kind of what you experienced when you went and talked to public servants, and they're like, well, this is the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
And it may actually not be. But if you think about neoliberalism driving a market model, and when we see the outcome, hugely problematic now all across many income strata, we call that a market failure. And I think this is an interesting thing to talk about when you talk with other people about this. Like, well, why isn't this just a market solution? The answer is markets fail. They don't always function. We know that. This has always been the case, right? Anyone who tells you that the absolute harvest, they're lying. So when markets fail, this is historically, this is not controversial. This is why we have government intervention. Now, the question becomes, and it's a good political question, of how much government intervention versus how much market. But in this case, look outside, right? There's too much of something and not enough of something else. So this seems to me to be the logic of government intervention. And actually it brings us back to maybe what a new conception of what the state role might be. Except that it's actually just an old conception of what the state role might be, right? So I think when we talk about this is not all that foreign, even in the United States. And it's just that we're going to go back to something that is probably a new version of what happened before neoliberalism. And that's also not unusual, right? We see major economic trends happening maybe every 40 or 50 years, which is why we're seeing destabilization. We're going to be moving to something else. Capitalism is always changing. So why don't we think about how we want it to change? And that's where I think ideas like this provide us fodder for something big.
Yeah, I would just say that's really well put. And it's a little frustrating for me, like I wrote a small op-ed piece on this. And the reaction is, you're like a socialist, communist. And it just speaks to this binaryism that exists. If you're not sort of in lockstep with a putative free market, and as you said, that's mythic in itself, that somehow you're put in this other binary category. And even social housing, it's like, yeah, it's true, you're moving the private developer who's involved in producing a certain percentage of housing in a space. You still have a lot of private developers in Vienna. It's not like that. You have architects who aren't state architects. You have builders who aren't state builders. You have subs. You have real estate agents. Yeah, I don't know how they finance it. So maybe it's financed through the public sector, but you get the drift, right? Engineers, they're not state engineers. It's just so silly to reduce this to like, oh my God, you're, this, I don't know, state socialist communist. It's just insane to me, and it just makes me sad that the debate gets reduced to that dichotomy. It gets in the way of just thinking pragmatically about how to just better our lives. The market's a tool that works well for certain things. When it doesn't work, then let's figure out how to complement it and use other tools.
We're just about out of time, but I want to.
Yeah, there's, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to rant.
For a better question for Professor Chen, but
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about governance structures of social housing boards around the world?
She probably won't be able to do them all, but maybe a couple, yeah. What's the, yeah,
Taiwan, yeah.
in Taiwan, okay. Professor Chen, I don't know if you heard the question, but do you know how the governance structure of the social housing is set up in Taipei?
I think that in every country, they need to find their own solution based on their social political structure. And in Taiwan, because we have been really a developmental state that has been under a very strong government. So the whole society's mindset, they still heavily rely on the government to do everything. But increasingly, the civil society is growing. So that's why another group of people, they say they want to do collaborate housing. They want to build the housing their own without the government being the major providers. Yeah. So, but I think that in you look at the world, how the social housing is provided, it is not necessarily coming that it can be everyone as long it's not for profit, and you are able to make the regulation to make it work as long it's not for profit, not for profit. Yeah, so it doesn't need to be even if it's from the private developers, it can work.
But it sounds like a boring issue in some ways, but in our task force, that one subgroup worked exclusively on kind of studying different ways to structure, because I do think it really makes a huge difference. That and building in maintenance fees, they always skimp on that, But that's the beauty, I would say, of mixed income units. They tend to function a lot better in maintaining and have good governance structures, because you bring in a lot of people with more social and cultural capital. Who kind of know how to navigate juridical worlds, they know lawyers, all this stuff, so they can really, in a way, teach people who don't have that social and cultural capital, those skills. So there was one more question. You got to end it, Brandon, or?
Well, I just want to be real sensitive to people's time. We're a little bit over on Zoom. So what I'd just like to do is just thank the panel.
Yeah, thanks.
For their participation. And I'm sure we'll be hanging out for a couple of minutes. So if you have a question in your here and you didn't have answered,
Okay.
we'll be around. But I want to just allow folks to
Yeah,
make their-
yeah, thanks, Brandon.
So thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll hang out informally, even Zoom, if you guys have questions.
I have a question in the chat. That we talk about, Rhode Island and Montgomery County, Maryland.
Yeah.
Taking their own first step for exploring social housing. Any attempts that the panelists know of to bring all these fledgling US initiatives together to learn from each other?
Well, I guess we're part of that, right? Trying to generate. But you're right, Rhode Island, I think at the state level, and a county or something in Maryland. Maine is toying with it, and Denver. Yeah. Yeah, and Denver as well. And I know New York City has been trying to do this and become a bit of a political controversy there.
Our campaign has also met with San Francisco, Portland, Denver, and a city in Florida that are all exploring.
Oh, cool. Similarly structured.
Similarly structured through
Yeah.
initiative process.
Well, yeah, right on. All right, we'll be here if you have a little informal, yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna mute.
So, okay.